The bar in Oceanside smelled like stale beer and broken promises, the kind of place where Marines went to forget and sailors went to disappear. The woman at the corner table had been nursing the same whiskey for 40 minutes, her eyes tracking the room with the kind of stillness that suggested either boredom or calculation. She wore civilian clothes that hung loose enough to hide muscle memory, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that revealed a jawline too sharp for softness. Nobody knew her name. Nobody knew why she was there. And nobody, especially not the lance corporal swaggering toward her with 3 drinks in his system and a chip on his shoulder, knew what she'd done in places that didn't exist on any map. He stopped at her table, blocking the dim light from the neon sign behind him. This seat taken. He didn't wait for an answer, sliding into the booth across from her with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by the right person. She looked up slowly, her expression neutral, her hand still wrapped around the glass. "It is now." He grinned, leaning back with his arms spread wide across the vinyl. "You military." She took a sip, let the silence stretch. "Used to be." That was all the invitation he needed. He launched into a speech about brotherhood, about the Corps, about how real warriors earned their place in the sand and the blood, not in some cushy Navy office pushing papers. His buddies at the bar were watching now, sensing entertainment. She listened without expression, her thumb tracing the rim of her glass in slow circles. When he paused for breath, she spoke. "You done?" His grin faltered. "What?" "I asked if you were done." Her voice was calm, almost kind, the way you talk to a child who didn't know better. Something in her tone made him bristle, made him lean forward with narrowed eyes. "Here's the thing, sweetheart. Here, you're a bitch if you can't back it up." He reached across the table, his hand moving to shove her shoulder, to assert dominance the way he'd learned in boot camp, the way he thought men did. His palm never made contact. Her hand moved like water, redirecting his momentum, her fingers finding pressure points that turned his aggression into sudden, shocking pain. The lance corporal's wrist bent at an angle that made his buddies wince from across the room. She held him there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the message to sink in but not long enough to cause permanent damage. When she released him, he jerked back, cradling his arm, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been the first stirrings of awareness. She stood slowly, picking up her glass and finishing the whiskey in one smooth motion. "You should ice that," she said, setting down a $20 bill that covered both their drinks. Then she walked toward the door, her gait unhurried, her shoulders carrying the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of and exactly when to use it. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word. The bartender, a former Navy gunner's mate with 2 deployments and a better eye for detail than most, watched her go with narrowed eyes. He'd seen that walk before, in the kinds of operators who didn't advertise what they were. The lance corporal was still at the table, his friends now surrounding him with questions he couldn't answer and theories that didn't add up. His wrist throbbed with a pain that felt personal, educational, like the universe had decided he needed a lesson in humility delivered by someone who didn't need to prove anything. Outside, the woman unlocked a truck that had seen better days, but ran like it had been maintained by someone who understood machinery at a molecular level. She didn't look back at the bar. Didn't need to. Inside her wallet, tucked behind a driver's license that showed a different name than the one in her service record, was a card she never showed anyone. It was worn at the edges from years of being carried, the Navy SEAL trident embossed in gold that had long since faded to bronze. Her real name was Lieutenant Kiera Vance, though she hadn't used it in 6 months. Her call sign in the teams had been Whisper, earned during an operation in Ramadi when she'd eliminated 3 insurgents in a building full of hostages without firing a single shot. The next morning, the story had already mutated. In the barracks at Camp Pendleton, the lance corporal whose name was Miller told a version where he'd been sucker-punched by some psycho who'd gotten lucky. His buddies, who'd actually seen what happened, offered corrections that he ignored. By noon, the story had reached a staff sergeant who'd done joint operations with SEAL Team 3 and recognized the description of the technique used. He made a phone call. By evening, That call had reached a commander at Naval Special Warfare Command who pulled a file that was supposed to be classified and swore quietly into his coffee. Kiera Vance wasn't supposed to be in Oceanside. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the West Coast. 6 months ago, she'd been part of a task force operating in the Hindu Kush, hunting a network that moved weapons through mountain passes that didn't appear on satellite imagery. The operation had gone sideways in ways that required 3 separate after-action reports and a closed-door session with people whose titles were redacted. When the dust settled, Vance had been given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Take 6 months of administrative leave while they figured out what to do with an operator who'd technically violated engagement protocols to save a village full of civilians, or accept a transfer to a training command where her skills would be wasted on PowerPoint presentations. She'd taken the leave, disappeared into the kind of anonymity that special operations veterans either embraced or suffocated under. The bar incident was the first time she'd surfaced in a way that left a trail. The commander who pulled her file was named Hastings, a career SEAL who'd known Vance since she was the only woman in her Bud S class and had refused to quit even when instructors invented new ways to break her. He remembered her Hell Week, remembered watching her carry a boat on her head through surf that had grown men crying for their mothers, her face set in an expression that wasn't determination so much as acceptance that pain was temporary, but quitting was permanent. He picked up the phone again, dialed a number that went to a different building on the same base. "She made contact," he said when someone answered. "Oceanside civilian bar with a Marine who didn't know any better." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers shuffling. "Was it clean? Textbook. No injuries, no police, no footage, but it's going to spread." Another pause. "Good, maybe that's what we need." Hastings frowned. "You want to explain that? She's been out too long." Getting soft around the edges. This was her testing herself, seeing if she still has it. And she has it. Now we need to give her a reason to use it. The line went dead. Hastings sat in his office for a long time after that, staring at the file photo of Kiera Vance in her dress blues, her expression serious, her eyes already looking past the camera toward something the rest of them couldn't see. He knew what they were planning. Knew it would require pulling strings that weren't supposed to be pulled and calling in favors from people who operated in the spaces between official policy and necessary action. But he also knew that operators like Vance didn't do well with idle time, that the things they'd seen and done required motion to keep from calcifying into trauma. 3 days later, Kiera was in her truck heading north on the Pacific Coast Highway when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number but answered anyway, her voice neutral. "Vance. Lieutenant, this is Commander Hastings. We need to talk about your leave status." She was quiet for a moment, watching the ocean scroll past her window, endless and indifferent. "I'm listening. How would you feel about cutting it short? Depends on what you're offering. Training rotation. Edwards Air Force Base. They need someone to run aggressor tactics for a joint exercise with Air Force pilots transitioning to F-35s. The offer hung in the air between them, and Kiera felt something shift in her chest, a tightness she'd been carrying for months loosening just enough to let her breathe. Aggressor tactics meant flying, meant being back in a cockpit where the rules were clear and the stakes were controlled. It wasn't the same as operational deployments, but it was better than bartending or the long, empty days where she counted ceiling tiles and tried not to think about the mountain village and the choice she'd made that had saved lives but violated a standing order. "I'm not rated for F-35s, she said finally. Hastings chuckled, a sound that carried weight. "No, but you're rated for F-16s and you've got more combat air hours than half their instructor cadre. They need someone who can think like an adversary, who can push their pilots past textbook maneuvers. You interested or not?" She thought about the bar, about the Lance Corporal's face when he realized his assumptions had cost him, about the way her body had moved without thought, muscle memory taking over in a way that felt like coming home. "When do I report?" "Monday. I'm sending you the details now. And Vance, sir, stay out of bars until then." She smiled, the first real smile in weeks. "Copy that." The line clicked off and she pulled over at a scenic overlook, staring out at the Pacific as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Edwards meant desert, meant heat and vast empty skies where sound carried forever and mistakes were visible from miles away. It meant being back among people who understood what it meant to operate at the edge of capability, where precision wasn't optional and hesitation got people killed. She thought about her call sign, about the operation that had earned it, about the 3 insurgents in Ramadi, and the way she'd moved through that building like smoke, using angles and shadows and timing that she'd learned from instructors who demanded perfection. Monday came faster than expected. Kiera drove through the Mojave in the pre-dawn darkness, her truck eating miles of empty highway, while the sky transitioned from black to deep blue to the pale gold of desert morning. Edwards Air Force Base sprawled across the landscape like something from another planet, all straight lines and concrete expanses, the kind of place where sound barriers were broken as casually as speed limits, and the very air seemed to vibrate with potential energy. She checked in at the gate, was directed to a building that looked like every other building on base, and found Commander Hastings waiting in a conference room with 3 Air Force officers who looked like they'd stepped out of a recruitment poster. They introduced themselves with call signs instead of names. Torch, a major with graying temples who commanded the aggressor squadron. Blade, a captain who'd done 2 tours in Syria and had the kind of eyes that tracked movement even when sitting still. And Kodiak, a lieutenant colonel who oversaw the joint training program and spoke with the clipped precision of someone who measured words like ammunition. Hastings made the introductions from her end. "Gentlemen, this is Lieutenant Kiera Vance, call sign Whisper, Navy SEAL qualified in multiple airframes, combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. She'll be running your adversary profiles for the next 8 weeks. Torch raised an eyebrow. "SEAL, I thought you folks stayed wet." Kiera met his gaze without blinking. "We go where we're needed. Sometimes that's underwater. Sometimes it's 30,000 feet up." There was a beat of silence, then Blade grinned. "I like her already." Kodiak opened a folder spreading reconnaissance photos across the table. "The exercise simulates near-peer conflict. F-35s versus advanced 4th-generation adversaries. We need someone who can exploit their training gaps, push them past what the manuals teach." Kiera studied the photos, seeing not just aircraft but patterns, vectors, the geometry of engagement that transcended any single platform. "What's the scenario?" Kodiak leaned back, folding his arms. "Contested airspace over a denied area. The F-35 pilots think stealth makes them invincible. Your job is to prove them wrong without actually shooting anyone down." Kiera smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach her eyes. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow, 0600. You'll fly an F-16 modified to simulate threat characteristics. 2 sorties a day, debrief after each engagement. Think you can handle that?" She thought about Ramadi, about moving through darkness with nothing but training and instinct, about the 3 insurgents who never saw her coming because she understood that the best fights were the ones your enemy didn't know they were in. "I can handle it." The briefing continued for another hour, covering rules of engagement, safety protocols, communication procedures. Kiera absorbed it all with the focused attention of someone who knew that details mattered, that the difference between success and catastrophe often came down to a single missed parameter or an assumption left unquestioned. When they broke for lunch, Blade caught up with her in the hallway. "Question," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "How does a SEAL end up qualified in fighters?" Kiera considered how much to share, decided on partial truth. "Joint task force work. Sometimes we needed organic air support in areas where calling in strikes would compromise operations. Easier to have someone on the team who could talk pilot." He nodded slowly, processing. "And they let you actually fly." "Let is a strong word. The Navy has a way of making suggestions that aren't suggestions." Blade laughed, a genuine sound. "Yeah, I've heard those suggestions. Look, most of the pilots you'll face tomorrow are good. Some of them are very good. But they've been trained to rely on their tech, on the idea that sensors and stealth give them an advantage that can't be overcome. And you want me to show them they're wrong." I want you to show them that tactics matter more than technology, that an adversary who understands their limitations can exploit them. That war isn't a video game where the best equipment wins. Kiera nodded, understanding the real purpose of this exercise. It wasn't about humiliating young pilots. It was about preparing them for a world where their enemies wouldn't play fair, where advantages could become vulnerabilities, where survival depended on thinking 3 moves ahead. That night she stayed in the visiting officer's quarters, a sparse room with a bed that felt too soft and air conditioning that hummed with relentless efficiency. She didn't sleep much, instead reviewing flight manuals and threat assessments, her mind mapping engagement zones and calculating angles of approach. At 0530, she was in the squadron-ready room, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of amber and rust. The F-35 pilots filed in over the next 15 minutes, a mix of ages and ranks, all wearing the kind of confidence that came from flying the most advanced fighter in the world. They noticed her immediately, the stranger in Navy fatigues among Air Force blue, and she could see the questions forming before anyone spoke. Torch called the room to attention, then introduced her with minimal fanfare. "This is Lieutenant Vance, call sign Whisper. She'll be flying aggressor for the next 2 months. She's here to make you better, which means she's here to beat you. Questions?" A young captain in the front row raised his hand. "Sir, with all respect, what's her background? I mean, no offense, but F-35s are a different animal." Kiera spoke before Torch could answer. "You're right, they are different. Stealth gives you first-look capability. Sensor fusion gives you situational awareness that legacy platforms can't match. But you know what stealth doesn't help with?" She paused, letting the question hang. "Decision-making under pressure. Tactics when your tech advantage disappears. Fighting smart when fighting fair isn't an option." The young captain looked uncertain, not quite convinced but not willing to challenge further. Another pilot, older, with the weathered look of someone who'd seen combat, nodded approvingly. "I'm in," he said. "Show us what you've got." The briefing continued with Torch outlining the day's scenario. A high-altitude intercept over simulated enemy territory, F-35s defending a strike package against an unknown number of adversary aircraft. Kiera would be one of those adversaries, using tactics and positioning to engage despite being outmatched technologically. When they walked to the flight line, the morning sun was already turning the tarmac into a shimmering heat mirage. Kiera's assigned F-16 sat in a revetment, its paint scheme modified to break up its visual signature, its systems upgraded but still recognizably old school compared to the sleek F-35s being prepped nearby. She did her walk around with the careful attention of someone who knew that mechanical failures didn't care about your experience level, checking panels and surfaces, talking to the crew chief about any quirks or issues. The chief, a technical sergeant named Ramirez, watched her with approval. "You actually know what you're looking for," he said. "Most pilots just go through the motions." "I had instructors who'd fail you for missing a loose panel," Kiera replied, running her hand along the leading edge of the wing. "Figure those lessons are worth keeping. Good attitude. She's solid, but the right engine runs a little hot on startup, smooths out once you're airborne." "Noted, thanks." She climbed the ladder, settled into the cockpit, began the startup sequence with the methodical precision of ritual. Systems came online one by one, displays lighting up, the aircraft coming alive around her. Over the radio, she heard the F-35 flight lead running through their checks, heard the controlled chaos of a modern fighter preparing for flight. Her radio crackled. "Whisper, this is Torch. You ready to show them what old school looks like?" Kiera smiled, keying her mic. "Torch, Whisper. Born ready. Just point me at the sky." The tower cleared her for taxi, and she followed the marshaller's signals out to the runway, feeling the familiar weight of gravity pressing her into the seat, the familiar anticipation of what came next. This was different from ground operations, different from the close-quarters combat that had defined most of her SEAL career, but the fundamentals were the same. Know your enemy, know yourself, and find the angle they weren't expecting. The F-35s launched first, 4 of them in a loose formation, their turbines producing the distinctive whine of fifth-generation engines. Kiera watched them climb, calculating, then pushed her throttle forward and felt the F-16's older but no less powerful engine respond with a roar that vibrated through her bones. The runway blurred, the nose lifted, and suddenly she was airborne, the desert falling away beneath her, the sky opening up in all directions. Over the radio, the exercise controller's voice announced the start of the scenario. All players, time on target in 15 minutes. Aggressors are weapons hot for simulated engagements. Flight leads check in. The F-35 lead, call sign Hammer, acknowledged with the calm professionalism of someone who believed they had every advantage. Kiera stayed silent, climbing to altitude, watching her radar display while keeping her own emissions minimal. The F-35s thought stealth made them invisible. They were wrong. Stealth reduced your radar cross-section, but it didn't eliminate it. And more importantly, stealth didn't hide your tactics, your patterns, your assumptions. Kiera had studied those assumptions in the brief, knew that F-35 pilots were trained to use their sensors to gain situational awareness, to position themselves for beyond visual range shots, to leverage technology to avoid close combat. So she did the opposite. She went low, using the terrain to mask her approach, her radar silent, relying on ground controllers for positioning updates via data link. The F-35s were hunting for her, their sophisticated sensors sweeping the sky, looking for the radar return that would give away her position. But she wasn't where they expected. She was below them, using a ridgeline to mask her climb, waiting for the moment when they committed to an engagement vector that left them vulnerable. It came exactly 10 minutes into the exercise. The F-35 flight split into two elements, one high and one medium altitude, coordinating their sensor coverage in a textbook sweep pattern. But textbook patterns had textbook vulnerabilities. Kiera waited until the lower element turned away from her position, then lit her afterburner and climbed hard, her F-16 accelerating with the violent grace of a platform designed for one thing: fighting. Her radar came online for exactly 3 seconds, just long enough to get a firing solution on the trailing F-35, then went dark again as she called the shot. Fox 2, F-35 bearing 270, Angels 15. There was a moment of stunned silence on the radio, then Hammer's voice, tight with surprise. "Whisper, how did you trade secret?" Kiera replied, already diving back toward the terrain, knowing the other F-35s would be vectoring toward her last known position. But by the time they got there, she was gone, running dark again, repositioning for another pass. The exercise continued for 40 minutes, and by the end, Kiera had scored 3 simulated kills against pilots who had never expected to lose. When they landed and gathered for the debrief, the mood in the room was subdued. The F-35 pilots weren't angry exactly, but they were shaken, confronted with the reality that their technological advantage wasn't automatic victory. Torch let them sit in that discomfort for a moment before speaking. "Gentlemen, what you just experienced is what we call asymmetric warfare. Lieutenant Vance used inferior equipment and superior tactics to exploit your assumptions. Anyone want to explain how she did it?" The older pilot, call sign Jax, spoke up first. "She stayed off radar, used terrain masking, waited for us to commit to a search pattern that created gaps in our coverage." Kiera nodded. "And," the young captain from earlier, looking humbled, added, "she knew we'd rely on our sensors, so she operated in a way that made our sensors less effective." "Exactly," Kiera said. "Technology is a tool, not a strategy. You fly the most capable fighter ever built, but if you think that makes you invincible, you're already beaten. Every advantage has a counter. Every system has a weakness. The pilot who wins is the one who understands both." The debrief continued for 2 hours, breaking down each engagement, analyzing decision points and missed opportunities. Kiera was direct but not cruel, pointing out mistakes while acknowledging what they'd done right. By the end, even the skeptical young captain was taking notes. As they filed out, Jax lingered behind. "That was impressive," he said. "Where'd you learn to fly like that?" Kiera considered her answer. "A long time ago, in places where calling for help wasn't an option. You learned to fight with what you have, not what you wish you had." He nodded slowly. You're going to make us a lot better. That's the idea. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated with variations. Each sortie introduced new scenarios: low-altitude penetration, electronic warfare, close-in dogfighting that exposed every limitation of both platforms. Kiera flew with the focused intensity of someone who understood that training was where you made mistakes so you didn't make them in combat. The F-35 pilots adapted, learned, grew more aggressive in their tactics. Some of them started winning their engagements, and Kiera celebrated those victories as much as her own because that meant the training was working. But there was one pilot who stood out, a lieutenant named Wells, call sign Ghost, who flew with a natural instinct that reminded Kiera of herself at that age. Wells was quiet in briefings, absorbed information like a sponge, and applied it in the cockpit with creative aggression that pushed boundaries without breaking them. After one particularly intense engagement where Wells had anticipated Kiera's approach and repositioned for a perfect intercept, Kiera made a point to catch her after the debrief. "That was good flying," she said. Wells, who was shorter than Kiera but carried herself with similar economy of motion, shrugged. "I got lucky. You were setting up for a beam attack and I guessed right. Luck is what people call preparation meeting opportunity. You saw the pattern, adjusted your positioning, and forced me into a decision I didn't want to make. That's skill." Something shifted in Wells's expression, a crack in professional composure. "Can I ask you something?" Kiera nodded. "How do you stay calm?" "I mean, everyone talks about situational awareness and decision-making under pressure, but how do you actually do it when everything's happening at once?" It was a good question, an honest question, and Kiera respected Wells enough to give her an honest answer. "You breathe. You train until the basics are muscle memory so you don't have to think about them. And you accept that fear and doubt are information, not commands. They tell you something might go wrong. They don't tell you to quit." Wells absorbed that, nodded slowly. "One more question. Shoot. Is it true you're a SEAL, that you did ground ops before you flew?" Word had spread, apparently, though Kiera wasn't surprised. Bases were small ecosystems where information flowed through informal channels faster than any official communication. "It's true. How do you go from that to this? I mean, they're completely different skill sets." Kiera thought about Ramadi, about the darkness and the silence, about moving through a building where one mistake meant dead hostages. "Not as different as you'd think. Both require understanding your environment, reading your opponent, making decisions with incomplete information. The altitude changes, but the fundamentals don't." Wells considered that, then extended her hand. "Thank you for the honesty." They shook, and Kiera saw in Wells the same hunger for excellence that had driven her through Bud S, through SEAL qualification training, through every challenge that people said she couldn't overcome. That night, alone in her quarters, Kiera sat at the small desk and wrote an email she'd been avoiding. It was addressed to Commander Hastings, subject line, "Status update." She kept it brief, professional, nodding her observations about the F-35 pilot's progression, the effectiveness of the training program, recommendations for future aggressor tactics. But at the end, she added a paragraph that wasn't about work. "Thank you for this assignment. I didn't realize how much I needed it until I was back in a cockpit. The bar incident in Oceanside was a moment of weakness, not a pattern. I'm ready to discuss next steps when this rotation concludes." She sent it before she could second-guess the wording, then sat back and stared at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed 30 minutes later with a response. "Glad to hear it. We'll talk about your future when you return. Until then, make those Air Force pilots earn their pay." Hastings smiled, a small expression that felt like progress. The next morning brought a weather system that grounded all flights, leaving pilots with the rare luxury of unscheduled time. Kiera used it to run, covering miles of desert terrain around the base perimeter, her pace steady, her mind processing the previous week's engagements. She was alone until the sound of footsteps behind her announced company. Jax caught up, his breathing controlled despite the heat. "Mind if I join?" "Free country," she replied. They ran in silence for a while, the only sounds their footfalls and the distant whine of ground equipment. Finally, Jax spoke. "There's a story going around about you and a Marine in a bar." Kiera didn't break stride. Stories have a way of growing in the telling. This one has specifics about a lance corporal who learned a lesson in manners. She glanced at him, measuring, and I'm wondering if it's true, if you really put him down without throwing a punch. Kiera slowed to a walk, breathing deep, considering how much to share. He made assumptions. I corrected them. Nobody got hurt in any permanent way. Jax laughed, a genuine sound. I would have paid money to see that. You know what the best part is? What's that? The lance corporal's telling everyone you must have been special forces. Says no regular sailor moves like that. Kid doesn't realize he's actually right. They resumed running, and Kiera felt something ease in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying since Oceanside loosening incrementally. This was what she'd needed. People who understood, who'd been where she'd been, who knew that capability wasn't about posturing, but about quiet competence demonstrated when it mattered. The weather cleared by afternoon, and they were back in the air for evening sorties. This time the scenario was different. A multi-axis threat with Kiera leading a flight of 2 aggressor F-16s against 6 F-35s defending a high-value target. The odds were deliberately stacked against her, designed to test the F-35 pilot's coordination and communication under pressure. Kiera briefed her wingman, a young Air Force captain named Torres who flew with aggressive confidence, outlining a plan that relied on creating confusion and exploiting the F-35's natural instinct to avoid merging. We can't win a traditional engagement, she explained. We're outnumbered and out-teched, so we don't fight traditionally. We split their attention, force them to make decisions faster than they're comfortable with, and create opportunities in the chaos. Torres grinned. I like the way you think. The engagement that followed was controlled violence, aircraft screaming through the sky at speeds that turned seconds into eternities, radar locks breaking and reforming as pilots maneuvered for advantage. Kiera drove her F-16 through turns that pulled G-forces that pressed her into her seat, her vision tunneling at the edges, her training keeping her focused on angles and energy, and the three-dimensional chess of air combat. She scored 1 kill, then forced 2 F-35s into defensive positions that took them out of the fight temporarily. Torres got another kill before being shot down himself by a coordinated bracket from Hammer and Ghost. In the end, the F-35s won the scenario, but it cost them more than they expected, and the debrief was intense with lessons learned on both sides. You made us work for it, Hammer said afterward, his tone carrying respect. At one point I lost track of which way was up, Kiera nodded. That's the goal. Combat isn't orderly. The side that handles chaos better usually wins. As weeks turned into months, the dynamic in the squadron shifted. The F-35 pilots stopped seeing Kiera as an outsider and started treating her as one of their own, inviting her to social gatherings, asking for advice on tactics that went beyond the official curriculum. She declined most of the invitations, preferring solitude but accepted enough to avoid seeming standoffish. One evening, sitting in the officers' club with Jax, Wells, and a few others, conversation turned to call signs. So why whisper? Wells asked, nursing a beer. Most call signs have a story. Kiera had been expecting this question for weeks, had prepared an answer that was true without being complete. Ramadi, 2009. Building full of hostages held by insurgents who were threatening to execute them if we came in loud. My team needed them neutralized without alerting the others. I went in alone, took out 3 targets silently, got the hostages out. My team leader said I moved like a whisper, and it stuck. The table was quiet for a moment, everyone absorbing what that meant, the implications of going into a hostile building alone, the calculations that had to be made in darkness with lives in the balance. 3 targets, Torres said quietly. How? Training, patience, and accepting that hesitation gets people killed. They never knew I was there until it was over. Jax raised his glass. To whisper, and to not being on her bad side. They drank to that, and Kiera felt something she hadn't felt in months, belonging. These weren't her teammates from the teams, weren't the operators she'd trained with and deployed with, but they understood the fundamentals of what she'd done and why it mattered. The next day brought a change in the training schedule. Kodiak called a special briefing with an edge in his voice that suggested this was more than routine. When they assembled, he had a set of classified documents spread across the table, each marked with red borders that indicated special compartmented information. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," he began. "We've been tracking developments in near-peer adversary capabilities. Specifically, we've identified tactics being employed by foreign aggressor squadrons that mirror what Lieutenant Vance has been teaching you. The difference is, their pilots aren't training. They're operational." He pulled up reconnaissance imagery showing aircraft that looked Russian or Chinese, their formations and maneuvers captured by satellites or high-altitude reconnaissance. "This is from 6 months ago, South China Sea. Their pilots are using terrain masking, running dark, exploiting exactly the kinds of gaps in sensor coverage that Vance has been demonstrating. Which means this training isn't theoretical. It's preparation for scenarios that are already happening." The room absorbed that information with the weight it deserved. Hammer spoke first. "So what's the mission?" Kodiak looked at Kiera, then back at the assembled pilots. "The mission is to get better, to take everything you've learned and push it further. Because if we end up in a real fight, technology alone won't save us." The briefing continued with updated intelligence assessments, threat profiles, and modified training scenarios that incorporated the new information. When it concluded, Kiera stayed behind, studying the reconnaissance imagery with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to read terrain and tactics from fragmentary evidence. Kodiak noticed. "See something? Pattern recognition," she said. "These formations, the way they're positioning for engagements, it's not random. They're practicing for a specific scenario, which is contesting access, preventing us from operating freely in their claimed territory. They're not trying to win dogfights. They're trying to make the cost of entry high enough that we reconsider." Kodiak nodded slowly. "That assessment matches what intelligence is saying, which is why your role here matters more than you might realize. You're not just training pilots. You're helping us prepare for a type of warfare that doesn't fit our current doctrine." Kiera understood what he was really saying, that the decades of American air superiority were ending, that future conflicts would require tactics and thinking that acknowledged peer adversaries rather than assumed dominance. It was a sobering realization, and it made the training that much more important. Over the following weeks, the intensity increased. Scenarios became more complex, incorporating electronic warfare, jamming, and situations where technology failed and pilots had to rely on basic airmanship and tactical thinking. Kiera pushed the F-35 pilots harder, refusing to accept good enough when excellence was possible. Some of them struggled, frustrated by challenges that exposed their limitations. Others thrived, discovering capabilities they didn't know they had. Wells fell into the latter category, her natural aggression tempered by improving judgment, her flying becoming more intuitive with each sortie. After one engagement where Wells successfully countered Kiera's approach by anticipating rather than reacting, Kiera made a point to emphasize it in the debrief. "What Ghost just did is what we've been working toward," she said. "She didn't wait to see my move and respond. She predicted it based on context and positioning and forced me to react to her. That's how you fight someone with better technology. You make them fight your fight, not theirs." Wells looked embarrassed by the attention but also quietly pleased. Later, as they walked back to the squadron building, she asked, "How do you know when you're ready? I mean, this is all training, controlled environment. How do you know you can actually do it when it matters?" Kiera stopped, turned to face her directly. "You don't, not really. But you train like it matters, you treat every sortie like it's the real thing, and you trust that when the moment comes, your body will do what it's been taught to do. And if it doesn't, then you adapt, because the alternative is dying and that's not acceptable." They stood there in the desert heat, two women who'd chosen paths that most people avoided, who'd accepted that excellence required sacrifice and that capability came from refusing to quit when everything hurt. "Thank you," Wells said finally, "for being honest, for not sugarcoating it." Kiera nodded, understanding what Wells was really thanking her for: validation, recognition, the acknowledgement that her path was legitimate and her struggles were worth it. That weekend, Kiera drove into town, found a bookstore that sold military history, and spent 2 hours browsing shelves while civilians moved around her without recognition. She bought 3 books about air combat in Vietnam, about pilots who'd fought without technology, who'd relied on skill and aggression and willingness to accept risk. That night she read about Robin's Olds, about his tactics and his leadership, about how he'd built a squadron that became legendary through training that acknowledged reality rather than optimism. The principles weren't new, but seeing them articulated by someone who'd proven them in combat reinforced what she was doing at Edwards. Her phone rang late that evening. "Commander Hastings. Vance, how's the training going?" "Effective. The pilots are learning, some faster than others, but they're all improving." "Good. I need to talk to you about what happens when this rotation ends." She'd been expecting this conversation, had been both dreading and anticipating it. "I'm listening." "You've been out of operational rotation for 8 months. That's long enough. We need you back, but not in the teams. There's a position opening up at Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Advanced Tactics and Training. They need someone who can bridge ground and air operations, who understands both sides of the equation." Kiera was quiet, processing. DevGru was the top tier, the operators who took on the missions nobody else could handle. Working in their training cadre meant shaping the next generation of that capability. "That's a staff position," she said carefully. "I'm not built for a desk." Hastings laughed. "Neither is anyone at DevGru. This isn't PowerPoint and coffee. This is developing tactics for scenarios that don't exist yet, testing equipment that hasn't been fielded, preparing operators for threats we're just beginning to understand. You'd be in the field as much as the office. And if I say yes, then you report to Dam Neck in 3 months. We'll get you current on qualifications, read you into the programs you need to know about, and turn you loose on making sure our people are as prepared as possible for whatever comes next." Kiera thought about the F-35 pilots, about Wells and her question about being ready, about the reconnaissance imagery showing adversaries who were preparing for conflict while hopping to avoid it. She thought about the bar in Oceanside and the lance corporal who'd learned that assumptions could be painful, about the choice between fading into civilian life or accepting that she had skills that mattered. "I'll do it," she said, "but I want to finish this rotation first. These pilots deserve my full attention. Wouldn't expect anything less. Keep me updated." And Vance, "Sir, good work out there. The feedback from Kodiak has been exceptional. You're making a difference." The call ended and Kiera sat in the darkness of her quarters, feeling the weight of decision settle into commitment. 3 more months at Edwards, then a new chapter. It felt right in a way that civilian life never had, accepting that her path led through service, and that trying to be something else was denying who she was. The next morning she flew with renewed focus, each engagement treated as both training and preparation for the responsibility she'd be taking on. The pilots noticed the change in her intensity, rose to meet it, and the quality of the sorties improved accordingly. 6 weeks before the rotation ended, something unexpected happened. Kiera was in the squadron ready room reviewing gun camera footage when Torch entered with someone she didn't recognize, a Navy captain with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits. Torch made introductions. "Whisper, this is Captain Andrea Cole. Call sign Hammer, different Hammer than our F-35 lead. She's from Naval Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic, here to observe and assess." Cole extended a hand, her grip firm. "I've been hearing stories about you, Lieutenant. Thought I'd see for myself." They shook, and Kiera sensed this was more than casual observation. "Welcome to Edwards, ma'am. What specifically would you like to see?" "Everything. I want to watch you fly, watch you brief, watch how you interact with these pilots. I'm evaluating candidates for a program that doesn't have a name yet, and your name keeps coming up." The next week Cole shadowed Kiera through every evolution, briefs, flights, debriefs, even the informal conversations in the hallway. She watched silently, took notes that she didn't share, asked occasional questions that revealed more than they seemed to request. After a particularly intense sortie where Kiera had employed tactics that forced 3 F-35s into a defensive posture that compromised their mission objective, Cole requested a private debrief. They sat in an empty office, the door closed, the air conditioning struggling against desert heat. "I'm going to be direct," Cole said. "We're developing a joint doctrine for contested airspace operations. It requires pilots who understand ground operations, who can coordinate with special operations forces, who can think tactically in environments where traditional air support isn't possible." Kiera waited, understanding this was leading somewhere specific. "We need instructors for this program, people who have operated on both sides of that equation. Your background makes you uniquely qualified." "I've already committed to a position at Dev Gru," Kiera said. "Commander Hastings made the offer and I accepted." Cole nodded. "I know. I talked to Hastings before I came here. He said you'd say that, said you honor your commitments, but he also said you should hear what we're building before you make a final decision." She pulled out a classified document, sliding it across the desk. "This is a concept of operations for integrated special operations and air support in denied environments. It's based on lessons from Syria, Ukraine, other conflicts where traditional air power was contested or unavailable. We're not just teaching tactics, we're inventing them." Kiera read the document carefully, seeing ideas that matched her own experiences, gaps that her specific skill set could fill. "This is ambitious. Ambitious is what we need. The old playbook doesn't work anymore. We need people who can write the new one." "I need time to think about it." Cole stood, extending her hand again. "Fair enough, but don't take too long. Wars don't wait for us to be ready." After she left, Kiera sat alone with the document, reading it again, seeing possibilities and challenges in equal measure. This was different from what Hastings had offered, broader in scope, more aligned with where warfare was evolving. That night she called Hastings, explained the situation, waited for his response. He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not going to lie, I want you at DevGru, but Cole's right, this program needs people like you, maybe more than we do. What do you think I should do?" "I think you should decide what serves the mission best, not what's easier or more comfortable. If this joint program can save lives by preparing people better, then that matters more than what I want for my own command." It was the answer she'd expected from him, the kind of leadership that put mission before ego. "I'll give you my decision in a week. Take the time you need." The remaining weeks at Edwards took on added weight, every sortie feeling like both conclusion and preparation for whatever came next. Kiera flew harder, pushed the pilots further, and saw them respond with the kind of improvement that made the exhaustion worthwhile. Wells, in particular, had evolved from promising to exceptional, her tactical thinking now matching her technical skill. After the final training sortie, a complex scenario that pitted 6 F-35s against 4 aggressors in a contested strike package defense, the debrief ran long as pilots from both sides analyzed every decision point. When it concluded, the room gave Kiera a standing ovation that she hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to receive. Torch spoke for the group. "You came here as an outsider. You leave as someone who fundamentally changed how we think about air combat. On behalf of everyone in this squadron, thank you." Kiera nodded, uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing the sincerity. "You did the work. I just pointed out what needed improving." "You did more than that," Wells said. "You showed us that technology isn't a substitute for thinking. That's a lesson we'll carry forward." The farewell party that night was subdued. Pilots and crew sharing stories, and making commitments to stay in touch that would be half-kept at best. Kiera left early, walking out into the desert night where stars filled the sky with the kind of clarity that only existed far from cities. She thought about her decision, about the paths before her, about the Lance Corporal in Oceanside and how a single moment of violence had led to this place. Her phone buzzed with a text from Cole. "Decision." Kiera typed her response carefully, knowing it would shape years to come. "I'm in." "When do I start?" The reply came immediately. 2 months. Report to Fallen. "Bring everything you've learned." She stared at the message, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came before new challenges. Then she typed one more message, this one to Hastings. "Thank you for understanding. I'll make sure this program honors what you were building." His response was brief. "I know you will. Make them better." The drive back to San Diego 2 days later felt different. the landscape scrolling past while Kiera's mind was already planning curriculum, imagining scenarios, thinking about how to translate lessons learned across different domains. She stopped at the same scenic overlook where she'd pulled over months earlier, looking out at the Pacific, thinking about trajectories and choices. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Vance. A voice she didn't recognize, female, professional. Lieutenant Vance, this is Sarah Chen from the Washington Post. I'm writing a story about women in special operations and I've heard your name mentioned. Would you be willing to talk? Kiera's jaw tightened. No comment. Don't call this number again. She hung up, blocked the number, and sat in her truck feeling the familiar frustration of visibility. She'd never sought attention, had specifically avoided it, understanding that her effectiveness depended partly on staying below the public radar. Someone had talked, someone who knew enough to be dangerous. The phone rang again. Different number. She answered with an edge in her voice. I said no comment. Easy whisper. It was Hastings. I just got a call from a reporter asking about you. I told her nothing, but you should know someone's shopping a story. Any idea who? My guess, probably that Lance Corporal from Oceanside. The story's been circulating in Marine circles, gotten embellished with each telling. Now it's reached someone who sees a headline. Kiera swore quietly. What do I do? Nothing. Don't confirm, don't deny, don't engage. I'll reach out to PAO, see if we can get ahead of it with a no-comment policy based on operational security. But Vance, this is going to get attention whether you want it or not. I never asked for this. I know, but it's happening, and how you handle it will matter. Just remember who you are and why you do this. The rest is noise. The call ended and Kiera drove the remaining hours to San Diego in silence, thinking about consequences and visibility, about how one moment of teaching someone a lesson had created ripples that were still spreading. When she finally reached her apartment, there were two messages waiting. One from Cole, saw the reporter inquiry, don't worry about it, focus on the work. The other from Wells, hey, just wanted to say thanks again for everything. Also, there's some reporter asking questions about you. Told her I don't talk to press. You okay? Kiera responded to Wells first. I'm fine, thank you for the discretion, stay in touch. Then to Cole, copy, see you at Fallen. She spent the next week preparing for the transition, going through her gear, reviewing manuals, trying to ignore the occasional ping on her phone from numbers she didn't recognize. The story, when it finally published, was smaller than she'd feared. A brief sidebar in a larger piece about military integration, mentioning an unnamed Navy SEAL who had defended herself in a bar and demonstrated techniques from special operations training. The Lance Corporal was quoted anonymously, describing the encounter in terms that made him sound humbled rather than humiliated. It could have been worse, but it was enough to generate questions from people who knew her, enough to require conversations she'd rather not have. The day before she left for Fallen, Kiera returned to the bar in Oceanside. Different time, different day, but the same smell of stale beer and the same worn booth in the corner. The bartender, the former gunner's mate, recognized her immediately. Heard you made quite an impression last time you were here, she ordered whiskey neat. Wasn't my intention. Never is, but that Lance Corporal Miller, he's been back, looking for you actually, wants to apologize. Not necessary. I told him that. Told him the best apology was learning the lesson and moving on. Think he understood. They sat in silence for a moment, the bartender wiping down glasses, Kiera nursing her drink. Finally, he spoke again. You heading out? New assignment, teaching. Well, whoever you're teaching is lucky. Not many people get to learn from someone who's actually done it. She finished her whiskey, left cash on the bar, and walked out into the California night. The next morning, she was on the road to Fallen, Nevada, where Naval Strike Air Warfare Center waited with hangars full of aircraft and pilots who needed what she'd learned. The base, when she arrived, felt different from Edwards' more operational, less experimental. The brief from Cole was direct and comprehensive. Develop integrated tactics for special operations forces and air support in environments where traditional capabilities were contested or denied. Test new equipment, write doctrine, train instructors who would train operators. It was a massive undertaking, the kind of challenge that would define careers. Kiera threw herself into it with the focused intensity that had carried her through every previous challenge. She flew, she taught, she wrote. She argued with people who thought they knew better until evidence proved otherwise. The program grew from concept to curriculum, from theory to practice. Pilots and ground operators trained together, learning each other's languages, understanding limitations and capabilities. 6 months into the assignment, Kiera was leading a training evolution that combined SEAL team insertion with close air support in a simulated denied environment. The scenario required coordination between ground operators calling in strikes, pilots navigating contested airspace, and controllers managing the chaos of modern warfare. It was going well until the communication system failed, leaving the ground team without air support and the pilots without targeting information. In the debriefing afterward, recriminations flew fast. The ground team blamed the pilots for not adapting. The pilots blamed the ground team for poor communication protocols. Kiera let them argue for 5 minutes, then cut through the noise with a voice that carried command. Enough! You're all wrong and you're all right. The problem isn't who failed. The problem is that you're still thinking in terms of air and ground as separate problems. They're not. They're the same problem, and until you internalize that, you'll never operate effectively when systems fail. She pulled up the scenario recording, walked them through decision points, showed them where assumptions had created failures. When comms went down, the ground team should have used alternate signaling. When they didn't, the pilots should have fallen back on basic visual tactics: smoke, flares, even just positioning over the target and letting the ground team adjust based on where you were. The room absorbed that, operators and pilots seeing their mistakes in a different context. A young SEAL lieutenant raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we train that? How do we practice improvising when everything goes wrong?" Kiera smiled, a thin expression that carried memory. "You create scenarios where everything goes wrong. You deliberately break systems, remove capabilities, force people to think rather than follow checklists, because war doesn't care about your procedures. War finds your weaknesses and exploits them. So we find them first here, where the cost of failure is just ego." The training evolution was redesigned based on that principle, incorporating deliberate failures, testing adaptability, pushing operators and pilots past their comfort zones. It was brutal, exhausting, and by the end of the rotation, the teams that graduated were operating at a level that impressed even the skeptics. Cole watched one of the final evolutions, standing beside Kiera as operators and pilots executed a complex infiltration and strike package with the kind of seamless coordination that looked easy but represented hundreds of hours of training. "You've built something exceptional here," Cole said. "This is going to change how we fight." Kiera nodded, watching the evolution unfold with the critical eye of someone who saw both success and remaining gaps. "It's a start, but doctrine is never finished. It evolves as threats evolve. Speaking of which, I need to brief you on something classified. Walk with me." They moved to a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility where conversations couldn't be overheard or recorded. Inside, Cole pulled up intelligence reports that made Kiera's pulse quicken. "Remember those reconnaissance photos from Edwards, the adversary tactics that mirrored what you were teaching?" "Yes. We've identified the unit. Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force, 9th Brigade. They've been training specifically to counter our stealth advantages, using exactly the kinds of tactics you demonstrated." Kiera studied the reports, seeing her own innovations reflected back through an adversary lens. "They're learning from us. More than that, they're anticipating us, which means this program isn't just about training anymore. It's about staying ahead of opponents who are getting smarter." The weight of that settled over them both. "What do you need from me? Keep doing what you're doing, but also start thinking about counters to your own tactics. If the Chinese are using our playbook, we need to write the next chapter before they do." Kiera spent the next weeks doing exactly that, gaming out scenarios where her tactics were used against American forces, identifying vulnerabilities, developing counters. It was intellectually exhausting, forcing her to think like her own enemy, but it produced innovations that made the training even more valuable. One evening, working late in her office, she received an unexpected visitor. The Lance Corporal from Oceanside, Miller, now a corporal in dress uniform, requesting to speak with her. She almost turned him away, then reconsidered. "Come in." He stood at attention, his bearing nervous but determined. "Ma'am, I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to say this. What happened in that bar changed my life. I was arrogant, disrespectful, and I thought rank and gender mattered more than capability. You taught me otherwise, and I've spent the last year becoming the Marine I should have been from the start." Kiera studied him, seeing sincerity that seemed genuine. "Why are you here?" "Because I'm being sent to a joint special operations unit, and I wanted you to know that what you taught me I'll carry forward. I'll treat everyone with the respect they earn through competence, not the assumptions I bring to the table." She nodded slowly. "That's all any of us can do. Learn, improve, pass it on." He saluted, she returned it, and he left. After he was gone, Kiera sat in her office thinking about ripples and consequences, about how one moment could redirect trajectories if the lesson was heard. Her phone buzzed with a message from Wells. "Just got accepted to test pilot school. Thank you for everything. Hope I make you proud." Kiera typed back, "You already have. Now go be exceptional." The months blurred together, training rotations and curriculum development and late nights writing doctrine that would shape how America fought its next wars. Kiera threw herself into the work with singular focus, avoiding the spotlight that occasionally tried to find her, deflecting interview requests, staying focused on mission over recognition. 2 years into the program, Cole called her to another SCIF meeting. This time, the intelligence was different. "We've got a situation developing," Cole said, pulling up satellite imagery of a disputed island chain. "Tensions are escalating. There's a real possibility of conflict, and if it happens, the tactics you've developed here will be tested for real." Kiera studied the imagery with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read terrain and threat. "What's the timeline?" "Could be months, could be weeks. We need to accelerate training, get more people through the program, prepare for the possibility that this goes hot. I'll need more instructors. Can't scale without people who understand the material." "Already approved. You'll get 6 more instructors, all volunteers with operational backgrounds. Your job is to make them as effective as you." The expansion was challenging, requiring Kiera to shift from doing to teaching others to do, from individual excellence to building systemic capability. Some instructors adapted quickly, understanding the principles and applying them. Others struggled, too wedded to traditional approaches to embrace the flexibility required. Kiera was patient but uncompromising, accepting that building capability took time but refusing to graduate anyone who didn't meet standards. 3 years into the program, the warning Cole had given became reality. Tensions escalated into crisis, crisis into conflict, and suddenly the tactics Kiera had developed were being employed by operators and pilots in real combat. She watched from Fallen as after-action reports came in, analyzing what worked and what needed refinement. The overall assessment was positive. Casualty rates were lower than projected, mission success rates higher, because people were prepared for chaos rather than surprised by it. But there were failures too, lessons written in blood that required immediate integration into training. Kiera rewrote curriculum based on that feedback, adding scenarios that addressed gaps, pushing training to match the reality of combat rather than the theory of doctrine. Through it all, she maintained contact with the people she'd trained, receiving messages from pilots and operators who credited their survival to lessons learned at Fallen. Wells sent photos from a carrier deployment, grinning in front of her F-35 with a scoreboard that showed successful strikes. Jax sent a note from a forward operating base, thanking her for teaching him to think rather than just follow procedures. Torres, who'd been her wingman years ago at Edwards, was now an instructor in the program, passing on what he'd learned to a new generation. The cycle continued, capability building on capability, lessons learned becoming lessons taught. 5 years into the program, Kiera received a summons to Washington. She flew commercial, wearing civilian clothes, trying to be invisible among business travelers and families. At the Pentagon, She was escorted to an office where admirals and generals reviewed her work, asked pointed questions about effectiveness and scalability, and discussed expansion plans that would take the program joint-wide. At the end of the meeting, a four-star general whose name carried weight in special operations circles asked the question that mattered most. Lieutenant Commander Vance, in your assessment, has this program achieved its objectives? She'd been promoted twice during her time at Fallen, but still thought of herself as the lieutenant who'd walked into Edwards uncertain of what came next. Now, sitting across from people who shaped national defense policy, she gave them an answer earned through years of seeing theory become practice. Sir, the program has exceeded our initial objectives in preparing personnel for contested environments. Casualty rates in recent operations are 40% lower than historical averages for comparable scenarios. Mission success rates are higher. Integration between air and ground elements is smoother, but we're not done. Our adversaries are learning too, adapting to our adaptations. The moment we think we've achieved enough is the moment we start falling behind. The general nodded slowly. That's the answer I was hoping for. Complacency gets people killed. Continue what you're building, and keep us informed of what you need. The meeting concluded with approvals for expansion, additional funding, and authorization to brief allied nations on the program. Kiera flew back to Fallen carrying the weight of increased responsibility, but also validation that the work mattered. That night, alone in her quarters, she thought about the bar in Oceanside, about the Lance Corporal whose assumptions had created a moment that led to this trajectory. She thought about the pilots at Edwards, about Wells and Jax and Torres and all the others who'd learned and taught and passed it forward. She thought about Ramadi and the darkness and the three insurgents who never knew she was there, about the call sign earned in silence and carried through years of service. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. This is Miller, the Marine from the bar. I'm a sergeant now, serving with MARSOC. Just wanted you to know I'm still carrying forward what you taught. Thank you for not giving up on me when I was too stupid to know better. Kiera read the message twice, then typed a response. Keep being excellent, Sergeant. That's the best thanks anyone can give. She sent it, then set her phone aside and walked outside into the Nevada night. The sky was vast and clear, stars scattered across darkness with the kind of beauty that reminded her why she did this work, why she pushed people past their limits, why she refused to accept good enough when lives depended on excellence. Somewhere, operators were moving through darkness on missions that would never be acknowledged publicly. Somewhere, pilots were launching from carriers to defend space and freedom that most people took for granted. Somewhere, young men and women were making the choice to serve, to put themselves in harm's way for ideals they believed in. Kiera Vance, call sign Whisper, had spent her career preparing those people to survive and succeed. The bar in Oceanside was years behind her now. The Lance Corporal who'd learned a lesson, just one of thousands who'd been taught that assumptions were dangerous and competence earned respect. The trajectory that started with 3 seconds of controlled violence in a dive bar had led to a program that was changing how America fought its wars. She didn't seek recognition, didn't need her name in headlines or her photo in articles. The work was enough. The knowledge that people came home alive because of training she developed was enough. The cycle of learning and teaching and improving was enough. Above her, a meteor streaked across the sky, a brief light in the darkness. She watched it fade, thinking about trajectories and moments and the choices that defined lives. Then she went back inside to prepare for tomorrow's training evolution, where new operators and pilots would learn the lessons that might save their lives when everything went wrong, and the only thing between success and failure was the quality of their preparation. The work continued.